Thanks, Geetha. Appreciate the introduction there. Yeah, as Geetha said, if you didn't kind of catch the meat of that, I'm not a Power Platform expert. I've used Power Automate a few times, along with some of the other Power Platform capabilities, but my realm is mainly the data science, data engineering areas. But really kind of what spurred this interest in Power Automate and the Power Platform was a client request. Frankly, they had been wanting to do something for a while and didn't know how to do it, so they came to us, and naturally, I went to Geetha on how best to design it and architect it. So, what we're going to look at today is really kind of a demo POC solution that we built that takes a variety of files from an on-prem system and moves them into Teams folders, i.e., SharePoint folders. So we're going to be using the file system connector in Power Automate for this. Really, it only requires a gateway to be set up and some minor connections here and there. But it's all, they've made it very simple to spin it up and get it going. So in regards to any technical lift on this, there's minimal kind of spin up required for it. But what I'm going to do is kind of walk through it, talk about some of the hiccups that we ran into potentially, and some of the limitations of it. So with that, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. I'm going to show two varieties of this. One kind of that we started with originally, and then a second one that was more in depth, more parameterized. And then I'll discuss really what ended up being the final solution for this problem. So we can dive on in, look at the demo. Okay, so what we're looking at here, and really kind of the base of all this, is the file system connector in Power Automate. Let me go to it. When we go there, just in the main Power Automate connector section, we can see there's a ton of templates out here. And as I was preparing for this demo, I actually saw that there were templates already out here for exactly what we had done. So it was kind of funny to see that there's multiple out here of the exact same solution, kind of verifying that there's a ton of different ways to do this. Really, just what best solves your problem is what's going to be the route to go with here. So what we're going to do in this whole process is we are going to pick up a file from a on-prem source in a given folder location, and we're going to move that file to SharePoint. And during this process, we're going to first set up kind of a recurring schedule on this. So we're going to use some of the other Power Automate features and modules, kind of an occurrence on there. And then we're going to check to see if the file exists using some metadata queries or some metadata checks. And then if the file exists, we're going to replace it. If the file does not exist, we're going to upload it. So we'll kind of walk through the pieces of this, but I'll hop over to the flow itself. So you see it's really only broken down into these four main steps. Obviously, we'll dive into each one, showing kind of how this was designed. But at the top of this, it's just a basic recurrence. This was for testing, so we want it to run once a day. Obviously, you could change this to be any number of things. You can run it at different schedules. I mean, once every second would seem kind of outlandish for this task and overkill, but hey, if you saw a need for it, that's great. At that point, why not just stream the data? But we can set up the recurrence on here if we needed to. And then here's kind of where we get into, I'll shrink all these down, what happens inside of this kind of scope module here. We'll dive into these piece by piece, but at a high level, we're going to use the file system connector to get the file contents and kind of retrieve that file using a path. And then we're going to get the properties, the file properties on SharePoint, basically to see if that file already exists. And then our conditional down here says if the file exists, replace it. If it does not exist, then we're going to create it. And then we've got two standard email things down here where if it fails, say it failed. If it succeeds, say it succeeds. So it's rather simple in regards to how the file connector, how the file system connector works. First off, it requires a gateway to be set up. But then once you set up that gateway, you just direct it straight to your file path, and you can do infer content type yes or no. If you want to specify the content, you're welcome to do that. We set it to yes just for kind of a testing. Just let Power Automate figure out what the file type is. The next step in here is really going to check SharePoint to see if that exists. So we're going to pass it the SharePoint site address. We're going to pass it the library for that, and then kind of the subfolders of where that goes. One thing in here that we do have to do, and this is for this version of this flow, there's other versions that don't require this, but just kind of walking through it, is we wanted to check for that particular file. So in this case, the file name was, test1 xlsx. All we're going to do is we're going to check to see if that file exists or not, using file leaf required on that one. And then from there, all this condition does right here in the beginning is we are looking to get the properties of that file. If the length of that, essentially we're just calculating, we're just checking to check to see if the file's there, and it's all we're really doing here. If the file does not exist, we're going to create it. If it does exist, we're just going to update it. So passing in the same things we saw earlier above, passing in the site address, the folder path, the file, and then the body, i.e. the contents of that file, so that we can upload that file to SharePoint. And then similarly, instead of using create file for SharePoint, we use update file over here, which is going to update that file with the new contents. And then from there, kind of a succeed or failure notification at the end of that. Now, what kind of drove this to go even further was that this worked great for a single file. But what if we needed to move 100 files? What if we needed to move batches of files at once? It's kind of where we took this to the next evolution of it, which uses really a SharePoint list in here, where we've basically stored all those variables that we just defined. We're going to put those in a SharePoint list now. And instead of calling our specific file name in our flow, what we're going to do instead is use a symbol applied to each. So it's the same setup as we just saw earlier in the previous one. Only difference is now we're pointing it at a SharePoint list, and then we're going to say, hey, for each item in that list, I want to loop through it, and I want to grab the file path. I want to grab the address we're sending it, the library we're sending it, i.e. the folder, and then our same conditional check, create file, update file, and then the email at the end of it as well. So this was kind of the second iteration of it, where we where we're able to move multiple files, and all of that the user or the client really has to do is make sure that the SharePoint list that it is all reading from is up to date, and they've got it pointed at the right spots. One of the main hiccups that we ran into in this, and it's well documented in the Microsoft documentation. I was naive when I first built it and didn't fully read the documentation, is that using this connector, there is a 30 megabyte file size limit. So any file over 30 megabytes, you cannot use this process on, which is kind of a bummer because it worked out great. But that is kind of the one main hiccup that I ran into, is using this file system connector, and they even have it, I think, big bolded up here, general limitations, is the file size limit. So that's just kind of the big call out that I want to bring up in regards to using this, is it makes sure you're working with small files, or you can maybe look at a way to do it in batches. So you're only doing 20 megabytes at a time, and then reading it in at that point. So kind of the next evolution, after we've shown them the original one where it's a single file, to hey, here's a great SharePoint list system that works. They then kind of came back and explained to us that a lot of the files they have are going to be super large. They could be, a couple gig files that could be larger or smaller. There's really no guarantee they're going to be under 30 megabytes. So I'm not going to go into the full architecture on that one. But essentially, we ended up using a run book connected to some Azure Data Factory pipelines to get that done. But in terms of using the file system connector in this regard to move files from one place to another, whether it's to SharePoint or whether it is to a different file system, or really wherever you want to take it, the file connector, this file system connector, is really useful for really moving those files, knowing limitations of 30 megabytes, and knowing that the gateways can be easily set up and configured to wherever your on-prem system is. And with that, I think that's really all the demo that I wanted to highlight, as well as the main call outs. Are there any comments, questions, anything from the group?
Paul, this is me, Ishwar. Hi. So one of the questions that I had was that how performant did you find this the file system connector? Was it quick, or was it like, if imagine you have like hundreds of files, do you see it behaving without performing without issues?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. When we tested it, when we were doing batches of 20 or 30 files, it was taking maybe 30 to 45 seconds a file. So it was performant. I would have liked to scale it up to 200 and see how it could perform, but I didn't notice any drastic slowdowns or performance concerns related to it.